So if you have questions, please line up now.
All right, darling. What is your question?
All right, so I would like to know what we might see next with signals integrations in Angular.
Oh.
We are looking at kind of some of the features that were described in the RFC, like signal components, signal change detection, signal inputs, queries as signals. I think our next target is to try to have kind of a sketch of what the zoneless integration might look like.
Question over here.
We are seeing that in the last Angular changes, there is like a more functional approach. So I'm wondering if the Angular team is going to continue doing that with services, components, and also I would like to know like what was the decision to, or is the the purpose of the motivation of doing that?
Yeah, so we've been looking a lot at developer experience as kind of a guiding star of how we want to evolve Angular. And I think a lot of the functional APIs that have landed, like inject, like router guards and HTTP interceptors, have been driven by that kind of just reducing the number of lines, the amount of boilerplate you have to write to accomplish simple things. I think we'll continue to take that approach in kind of other areas of the framework. Components is a good example. Like, we want to look at the boilerplate around writing a component, and can we make any changes there? I don't know if the answer is functional components or not. We're going to look at that kind of from a holistic perspective and try to take all of the functionality that is Angular, inputs, outputs, queries, effects, everything coming with signals, and try to understand, is there a better way? Is there a more ergonomic and better experience we can provide around writing components?
All right, we got a question here.
All right. Going forward to optimize change detection, would you be recommending using signals in the template instead of like an async pipe?
Yes. Yeah. No, I think like the signal experience, I would say, is better than the async pipe because you don't just get to use it in the template. We've had feature requests for years of like, can I have the async pipe but in a component? And that is basically what signals gets you. So you do the same thing with observables that you always have, and you can call toSignal in your component, and then you get that value synchronously in the component without having to deal with like null or undefined. Same in the template. And you get the same behavior with regards to performance with async pipe and on push.
Well, and also, if you have an observable that you want to bind to in the template, you should be using async pipe, not necessarily converting it to signal and binding to the signal. So it depends on the use case as well. But yeah, I would recommend that your bindings are signals, just like Alex said.
All right. Is this on? Speaking of signals, so Gregor today at 4:09 p.m. would like to know, how do you imagine Angular in 5 years from now?
See, it's a tricky question because there are some things that we have tentatively in mind of like, this is a direction we would like to explore, but it is too early for us to say like, yes, we're definitely going this way and it's going to look like that. And we don't want anybody to get concerned of like, oh no, they're going to change everything. It's like, we don't even know yet. So I think there are some concrete things we do know though, which is one, moving towards fine-grained reactivity with signals, and that going to be moving through the ecosystem, right? Because it will take time for that to propagate to the ecosystem, and we're aware of that, right? We don't just put it in the framework and everyone switched over overnight, right? There will be work to move it into forms and router and the entire extended ecosystem. I think that also a lot of work in server-side rendering and hydration and further evolutions of that are very heavy in our minds, and trying to make that easier to use as part of Angular and seeing how we can reduce the barriers to more and more apps using that. Anything?
If you ask Jessica and Andrew who work on hydration, like what Angular will be in 5 years, you might get a sense from their response that we're going to be underwater.
All right, I'll put you down for a maybe. Thank you.
We have a question over here.
I have a similar question. So let's briefly fast forward to 2025. Which core feature of Angular would you like to see partly, at least partly, powered by AI?
You say powered by AI?
Partly powered by artificial intelligence.
Here, I'll let you go.
Well, for sure, like development is changing, and there are AI tools that are supporting our developer processes. I would say that AI is unlikely going to be creating all of your Angular applications out there, but you might be using AI tools to speed up your developments, so that AI can do the boring things for you.
If we're being really optimistic, it would be cool to see AI involved in migrations.
Yeah. Yeah, like there are definitely interesting use cases, and we are absolutely not experts on AI, but things like migrations, things like asking questions in documentation, things like code scaffolding, right? Those seem to be the use cases that a lot of AI tools are globbing onto.
When it comes to AI, there's a lot of action items for us.
It never stops.
All right, we've got a question in this line.
With a lot of the features, new features that we're seeing now with signals and standalone components and even hydration, there seems to be a bit of a great merging of all of the frameworks sort of, providing a lot of the same features. So my question is, what does the Angular team see as being the main differentiator between Angular and some of the other frameworks we have?
I think any of us can answer this, but we're all going to give slightly different answers. So I'll start and say, I think that, maybe this is too controversial. I'll say that that's too controversial. I'm not gonna say it. What I will say is providing a more holistic package for applications, right? Is something we care about doing, right? Not just the framework, but also having first-party UI components and UI component primitives, router and forms, all being first-party offerings. That is something we think is a big part of what we do and the value proposition. I'll hand this off for more answers, though.
Yeah, I completely agree, and I'll add one more answer. So there are some organizational constraints that we have. Like at Google, there are 4,500 apps using Angular or something like that. And we want to evolve the framework gradually and keep it stable. So having smooth update experience and incremental adoption path for small and big features, pretty much what we mentioned during the keynote. And of course, everyone would say that every single library out there is stable, but you don't know whether it's stable until you run tests, 100, I don't know how many millions of tests we have on tap.
Yeah. So yeah, what Minko says, a lot of times when we are making changes to Angular, it is running through all of the tests for all of the applications at Google that run Angular. And that is a level of trust and confidence in the changes we make that I think is hard to come by. And we also try as hard as we can to be predictable, right? We're going to do major releases every 6 months. We have a clear browser support policy, a clear deprecation policy. We're very committed to not trying to surprise anyone.
Yeah, maybe I'll add a little bit because Minko kind of stole mine. We are committed a lot to kind of backwards compatibility and kind of smooth upgrade paths. But it's also very easy to be stable if you are not making changes. And one of the things I like about us is we do kind of push aggressively in some circumstances to push the ecosystem forward. You see this recently in shipping more modern versions of JavaScript, updating the Angular package format to ES 2022, for example. So we're trying to actively push the whole web forward in a lot of these offerings.
All right, this might be an opportunity for Jeremy to be even more controversial. Ethan would like to know, is there an expected timeline for Angular material to be fully migrated to use design tokens? Hit me.
So no concrete timeline. We have a goal in mind, but you might be able to guess what that goal is. But the team is actively working on getting all of the components switched over to design tokens. So the team has been working on basing Angular material on top of these primitives that can't come from the material design organization inside of Google. We've been working on that for a long time. And that has been a necessary step in order to make this move towards design tokens in order to give much more flexible theming and much more customization. And we are very excited about it, but it's very difficult to make these changes, honestly. Like I mentioned, we're running thousands upon thousands of tests on every change, and surprise, a lot of people override the CSS in the UI components, and so it's a lot of manual work when we're making these changes to go and fix things around Google. So it's a little bit slow going, but we are making good progress, and I'm excited about that landing in the near future.
Got a question over here?
So we have now computed signals. Do we see a future of Angular without pipes?
I don't know about that because the internet is a series of pipes.
So, yeah. What I'll say is we have asked ourselves the same question and have not yet answered it.
I have a question concerning the preparing for the future when we use signals to power our templates. Because currently I'm having a general pattern that I'm having a a data object for my component and an async pipe, so an observable that spits out changes for this data model for everything in the component. And with the fine-grained reactivity, I now got the feeling that I have to get away from that pattern and dissect this model into separate pieces, which individual, for the moment with async pipe, maybe individual observables. But I just want to know if I'm on the right path here, if I go back to my team and tell them, hey, this model is a bit old because in the future, the template is not rendered completely and there's not just one event that renders everything. And I have to split my model, or I have to think about splitting this view model, actually, the data model, the observable in the moment. Am I right?
Yes, I think have to is a fairly strong characterization, right? I think it's perfectly fine to have a model in a single signal and bind it throughout the template and read that signal in multiple places. Angular will handle that just fine. It will be no less performant than it is today with the async pipe or with zone change detection. Where you may want to make changes is if you have parts of that model that update very rapidly, where you want to take advantage of kind of the finer grained change detection that will be possible with signals.
Yeah, I'll add on to that, right? The signals we have are primitives, right? And those primitives are used for constructing larger experiences, larger applications. And there's no one size fits all pattern for how you would use them. And it's ultimately going to be up to the application to decide what is the right granularity of signal that works for you. And we will almost certainly have some guidance on this in the documentation when this gets to, out of developer preview and everything. But there's trade-offs on either side of the spectrum in terms of how much overhead is there in tracking, or how broadly used is any given signal value, right? If you put your entire application's state in one object and had one signal and used it everywhere, right? It's you have global change detection again. Or you can go like the opposite direction and track every like string number and Boolean in a separate signal, but then you have like tons and tons of signals, right? Like the answer is always going to be somewhere in the middle, and it's going to depend on the application.
All right, I've got a question over here. Reactive forms have gotten a lot of love as of late. Is there any work planned on improving template-driven forms? Please say yes.
It's complicated. What do we want to say, Alex?
Ooh, yeah. Forms and signals are an interesting proposition and a big open question for us. We are going to have to do some design work to understand how forms will need to change for signals, whether that change will be kind of like straightforward and just added signals in a few places, or whether we will need to kind of rethink how data flows through forms. So we plan to give forms some attention in the near roadmap, or maybe midterm roadmap. And I think at that point, we will also look at, are there other improvements we want to make to forms, particularly around like template-driven and reactive forms, and whether they might, get together someday.
It's a formidable problem.
Just every single day.
Yeah.
So related to the two new RFCs, I was wondering if you see a future where we are going to have to create our custom blocks to replace the structural directives that we have.
Yeah, there's no plans for that. Like structural directives, they're going to stay. Like no plans to change them. The blocks that we have proposed in the RFCs are a way to give us like a syntactic space for things that are built into the framework. We also currently don't have any plans for like letting people define custom ones of those at this point in time. I won't say that won't ever change, but there is a value for us to be able to have this like syntactic space to say like, here is a thing that is built into the framework.
Yeah, the reason ng-switch does not work with template type checking is the ng-switch is actually like 3 different directives that collaborate. And it's very hard to provide like an extensible API for how different directives can express to the template type checker how they work together. The new kind of like block syntax for control flow allows us to kind of just understand what the user is trying to say in the template without needing it to go through an abstraction that is like extensible and can be built upon. So there's a lot of value that we get from having kind of a built-in syntax for things.
Yeah. So you won't be blocked from using structural directives.
Hey, too, Jeremy. Me too.
Hey, that's my job.
Hey, so one of the things that I really like about Angular when I upgrade from one version to another is kind of like the tooling, like if anything gets deprecated or like, a bunch of method things change or whatever, you guys kind of automatically do that. You add some new things to my configuration or whatever. But Flex layout was something that we'd been using for a while, and then back in October, I know it was in beta, so there was no sort of, need to support or whatever, as well as you can just pretty much do everything that it does with CSS. That was basically our solution when we took Flex layout out of our application. But like, it didn't seem like it was that. What was sort of, I guess, if you could go into some of the reasoning behind the deprecation, as well as like, maybe it would have been nice to have some tooling to automatically generate the CSS for our components.
No. I said no. Yeah, so like you mentioned, right, it was in beta, so that did weigh very heavily into our decision not to spend time making like migration schematics, just because like we have a limited number of people on the team, hours on the team, and what we can put our time and energy into, and we like the fact that it was in beta meant that it didn't like have that same support level as everything else, and it was also going like we did look into it a little bit, right? Like
I was going to
spent
say
some
we
time.
actually spent a good amount of time looking at the migrations, and you're right. Like the thing I like about Angular is the fact that when I update, I don't necessarily have to look at everything that was updated, and I get a lot built in. But we also only do that when we feel like we can provide like a really great experience there. And Flex Layout was something where CSS has gone so far beyond. Flex Layout was created prior to CSS Grid being even scoped in the web space. Like there is so much new in the CSS space, and if you don't keep up with the CSS DevRel team, like they're pushing things we don't even know about. So the level of migration needed there for the things that CSS is capable of, that package would need, made it so that we felt like that wasn't a viable, like positive experience we could provide as a team. But we did look into it in quite a lot of detail, and we are aware that there is adoption there.
And there is also a community fork, by the way, of CSS Flex Layout that is still maintained by folks.
Well, thank you very much.
Question over here. Could you do an elevator pitch for Angular for students, why they should pick learning Angular over other frameworks?
Oh, this feels like Mark.
Go, Mark. Go, Mark. Oh, yeah. It's your question. It's your question.
Well, so it's a hard thing to say elevator pitch on the moment when you're not in an elevator. Okay. No, so I think the reason to learn Angular for a student is that lots of students are being taught fundamentals of programming. They're learning things like object-oriented programming. They're learning lots of structure. Angular comes with a lot of those things already a part of it. Learning TypeScript, for example, is going to serve you throughout your learning journey and throughout your career as a developer. Because if you work on the back end and you do something like Java, understanding types, understanding generics, all of that is just pure value for you. And then you learn something like Angular where there's so many opportunities. When you go for your internship, you go for jobs, you're gonna find opportunities out there for you, and you'll be able to speak really clearly about programming practices and things like that. You can learn everything. Everything's great. Jeremy and I say on our stream all the time, everything is great, but Angular's better. All right.
My God, you're good at your job.
So I can add one more thing, because when I started using AngularJS, I was in university, and I had to pick a framework for which I was going to build my next project. And I was thinking, what should I be using? I have this obsession about design patterns, and nothing else was providing like best practices to this extent. And Angular came with dependency injection. I learned about the composite design pattern because of the composite like component composition and so many other things. So yeah, just best practices. It comes in with testing from the end, which is from the beginning, which is something that people need to consider.
Hi. With other implementations like Solid, Preact, NanoStores, et cetera, is there any collaboration being done to have a unified or standardized approach to signals?
Ooh, that's an interesting question. Not really. And the reason behind that is that these signal libraries, they all look very similar on the outside. They have kind of similar interfaces. But when you get in the details of how they're integrated into their various frameworks, it's incredibly custom. And so Angular signals, for example, were built not just to support kind of the zoneless Angular, but also to support interop with Zone.js. So a number of the design decisions that went into how effects work under the hood, how we integrate with templates and such, are kind of custom built to support Angular's specific requirements. And that's true of the Vue reactivity package. That's true of the new package that Solid is building. So we have thought about kind of, can we use off-the-shelf things? But every time we've looked at that, it has come back as like, oh yes, but it wouldn't be quite as optimal. And at the end of the day, these are fairly actually small libraries in their implementation. Angular Signals is only a couple of kilobytes. And yeah, it just makes more sense to build our own. We can be more optimal that way.
Yeah, and I'm going to add, we brought it to some folks from TIS39 just to evaluate. And yeah, what Alex said, just the semantics is so much different, even though the API surface is so small.
I will also add one more reason why we have our own version of Signals, which is that there is an overhead to third-party library dependencies. And like that means it's an extra thing you have to explain to developers, right, for onboarding. And like, not that this affects, most people, but inside of Google, there is like extra burden for dealing with third-party libraries and the update process for those. And so it also is like an additional smaller reason for us.
Hi, I would like to ask a seemingly simple question. So what is Angular for? There seems to be a lot of sort of changes lately to make things simpler to build, sort of optimizations to make sort of simple websites easy, but I think the majority of us in this room build complex applications. So how does the team sort of balance those tensions?
So we hear this a lot about like, why are we making it easy, or why are we focused on like the learning journey, or making it easier to onboard? But if you think about this, your applications, as you build them up, everyone builds everything for scale over time. And things like signals, we had to implement signals because at scale we found significant problems, right, with the other solutions for change detection. So think about that as you're talking about, well, yeah, there are some foundational things that we're making simpler, but those things will carry on with your applications as they scale anyway, though. And as those developers on your team, let's say you onboard a bunch of new developers, you don't hope for them to stay junior forever. You hope for them to grow in the application. So them being strong and learning in the early parts, that only serves your teams in the long run.
All right. Ooh, I like this one. With all these new features in place, is the Angular team preparing a better or right path to follow to improve the learning curve of the framework?
Yeah, we are. We're working on it super hard. So we just released the first new tutorial, but we got feedback, and people were like, oh yeah, can you make that better? And we're going to continue to make things better. And that's the reason I'm answering this, because this is one of the things that I care about the most, is how to teach Angular and how people are able to learn it, right? So that's something that we're always talking about, and we're always kind of focused on how do we make this where the cognitive load and how you reason about Angular, how do we tell that story in a more clear way? And I think that people have traditionally said, well, if you're gonna learn Angular, there's this really big learning curve, but you'll eventually get it. And I'm not sure that's the whole story. I think depending on where you focus on, you have to take your like personal confirmation bias of like your sharp edges and not project those out. Right? So we can tell the story in a different way that can still get people the depth that you're hoping for, but we can still start them on a path where they can adopt features as they need them versus saying, well, you're going to learn Angular, so you have to learn observables first. Well, that's not true, right? You can build a lot of stuff before you get to observables. But we want to also make that story easier for them when they do get to observables. Like, how do we make that more clear? So that's something we're always thinking about, and we're going to continually like focus on and grow it.
Like that. Woo! Yeah.
Hi, my question's about module federation. I'm just wondering if you guys have any plans on providing a more official support from the Angular team in guidance on how to implement it through your builders, or do you think it's better to let like NX handle with their tooling? And
Yeah, so something that we have been looking at over the past, I would say over a year now, is different patterns for micro frontends and best practices in each one of them. Module federation has some really sketchy things out there that can like definitely let you like shoot yourself in the foot like very efficiently, and but there are also no perfect solutions for micro frontends really, because of like there is really no great way for you to be sharing a runtime. So something that we should do at a certain point is summarize our findings in a blog post. And this has been on my to-do list.
Yeah. It's been on your to-do list for a while. But yeah, I'll also add on this, right? Like, we definitely hear this question a lot, right? Especially from larger enterprises and even inside of Google, right? There is this question of like how to do this. And while it's not something we're focusing on in the short term, like it's definitely a project that is always floating around in our conversations.
Yeah, and in the short term, module federation is not going to be part of the Angular CLI. That's, I guess, the short answer that maybe you were looking for.
Hello. Oh. I love the recent work on improving LSCP, namely the hydration and the ng-optimized image. But speaking of another metric, time to first byte, will we see in Angular streaming of SSR response? So as Angular renders parts of application, it already gets sent to the client.
Well, there's a lot to that. We definitely get asked this a lot too, and this I think is where signals and server-side rendering, that's where a great partnership will happen, because with our current global change detection model, the streaming is a big problem because it kind of doesn't work, and this is the long and the short of it. So, like, in order to actually have something like streaming work, we actually need to have signals integrated more deeply first. But it is something that we are definitely looking at and are excited about the potential for in, the nearer term.
Yeah, I think getting away from DOM emulation too is a big to-do on the before streaming checklist.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and also in addition to that, we try to provide tools now. Also, like defer would be one of the primitives that would allow you to reduce the total blocking time, and there might be some other things like the hydration, like this lazy loading of routes, and what Jess and Mark had on a slide, where the hydration happens for the main frame and then for the separately, asynchronously for the part where the component is being loaded. This is also kind of a way to improve that. And yeah, so while the streaming is a few steps away from us, there are some tools that tools and primitives that we want to provide to improve that meanwhile in the short term.
And another very effective way to reduce the time for the first byte is to render your application to in the closest location to the user possible. So with Cloudflare's workers and the rendering there at the edge, that's another option.
Great question over here. I love this. What is the best way for a new contributor to help give back to the Angular community?
There's the help wanted flag on the repository. We're always looking for help there.
Yeah, like a classic answer is always like documentation as well. Like the first thing you need to get, the first hurdle you need to get over in contributing is just learning how to contribute, of just like, how do I, write a commit message that, meets the requirements, and how do I send a PR? How do I, go through the whole flow end to end? And sending a documentation PR is typically a good way of doing that without having to get bogged down in like the coding part of it.
And there are many other ways. You can organize a meetup. That's a great way to contribute. You can answer to a question on Stack Overflow, or you can help someone on Twitter, or you can go to a meetup and just speak or just listen to the content and talk to people. All these are great ways to contribute back to Angular.
You can also go to ng-conf and then ask a question when the panel happens.
Got another question over here?
First of all, thanks, guys, all of you, for being here. Being at ng-conf this year, really appreciate it. So with Angular 15, we got the inject function, which kind of took Twitter by storm. This year, we're with signals, right? And I know the inject function, that was kind of a surprise to everyone that went so crazy on Twitter. So my question to you is actually, what's one of the features of Angular 15, Angular 16 that is one of your personal favorites that you wish the community would talk about more? And why is it directive composition?
Yeah. So I'm gonna jump in first here, and I really say, like, if you're not using the directive composition API, you're really missing out. Because it is such a powerful composition model. I might be biased, having like worked on UI components for such a long time, but the menu example is the one that like really like sells it for me. Is those like put the spotlight on it of like, yeah, here's all the code for the menu, and I can just drop it in here. I get all of that behavior, the keyboard interaction, the ARIA attributes, the like everything related to it. No template, right? You define your own template, your own styles, and your own API, right? So you don't even have to know that the CDK is under there. And you can decompose component behaviors into directives in any way you want, right? Obviously, like, it's not free, right? You don't put like 200 directives in there, but it's a really powerful way of sharing behaviors across components.
Speaking of work Christian did, there's also the required inputs and the type coercion on the inputs. That's something that I haven't heard anybody really talk about, but it's awesome. People have been asking for that for a long time.
The type coercion for inputs, that just landed Tuesday. Like that just came out Tuesday. We didn't talk about that at all, this ng-conf. You can now specify a transform function on inputs to say like, oh, you know, this input can accept a string or a number or something else or null or undefined, and this transform function will always just turn it into a Boolean.
Someone in the community already implemented signal inputs with transform, which is just crazy to me. Like, so now I don't have to do it. I'll add my favorite feature to the mix, which is Andrew Scott's work on the router route parameters going to inputs. I think is just really cool and saves a bunch of activated route shenanigans.
And my favorite is hydration. There is just so much engineering complexity happening under the hood, and you just add one line in there and it just works.
Oh, another thing I'll add is, again, work that Christian did, the standalone migration.
Oh yeah. So Christian's not here at ng-conf, but like a whole bunch of the quality of life features we've talked about were done by Christian, who is just feature after feature after feature. He's a machine. Like
We'll scope something out and say like, we think this would probably take 3 weeks to implement, and then Christian, like, we wake up the next morning, he's like, oh yeah, here's the PR.
You know, you're joking, but I wouldn't be surprised if he has completed another feature by the time we get back.
I've been told by the powers that be that we cannot keep the Angular team here infinitely. So I apologize, but you are our last question. All right, are you ready? Make it good.
Hi guys, thanks for this. You guys were building a lot of cool features to Angular 16 and then with standalone signals and other stuff, right? So what's coming in for CDK and material? So you guys have anything planned?
Yes. So the biggest thing we are working on for Angular Material specifically is token-based theming API. So if you have been following like material design at all, there was this big shift to design tokens, which are basically like, you know, hundreds of variables that control all of the different aspects of components, ranging from color, typography, spacing, borders, et cetera, et cetera. And it gives you really fine-grained control over the appearance of that component, but still falling within the bounds of the material design spec. And it has been a lot of work getting the components to be moved over to those design tokens. But when that is ready, you will get so much more flexibility, and you'll be able to get support for like later material design versions, and it will be much more easy. It's much easier to just drop in like pre-made sets of tokens in order to do that. On the CDK side, what our number one goal is to add more interaction primitives. So you may have seen recently, like the more recent ones we added were list box and menu. There's already a dialogue in there. And the next one we want to do is combo box. We want to do tabs so that you can take advantage of the directive composition API and just add these behaviors to get your own custom components that really you just get to make your own template, your own styles, your own API, but get all of the benefits of the hard component stuff just from the library.
Awesome. Let's hear it for the Angular team.